When I first joined the Episcopal Church, it took me a while to understand the concept of liturgical seasons. Even after I successfully decoded the color changes, for instance, we are now back into ordinary time, as we can see with the green vestments, I was confused as to why some seasons, like Christmas and Easter, carried over their liturgical colors for an entire season, and why others, like Epiphany and Pentecost, don't. This is puzzling because the Feast of the Epiphany is a really big deal in the Church. It is one of the 7 principal feast days, and as Father David mentioned in his sermon last week, when it occurs during the week, the rector of the parish has the option of transferring the readings to the following Sunday, displacing the usual readings. And apparently that's a very big deal, and it only happens really rarely. As I prepared to preach today, though, I noticed something very intriguing about the Epiphany story, something I'd never seen before. Unlike the birth narratives with Mary and Joseph, or Zechariah, or the shepherds, the Epiphany occurs with really minimal, or maybe even not any, direct intervention from God at all. As Matthew describes it, the Magi learned about the birth of Christ the way they, presumably, found out about other important events. They observed and interpreted the stars. And then they used another star to find their way to the stable in Bethlehem, and also paused to ask directions. But this star navigation was the same way that people in the ancient world had navigated for at least 2,000 years before Christ was even born. Yes, it was a special star to commemorate a very special birth, and their arrival, the arrival of the Magi, made it even more striking, even more powerful. I would imagine that most of us don't have royalty as part of our birth narratives, but visiting a family with a new baby and bringing gifts, I imagine that most, if not all of you, have done the very same thing or had that done for them, for those of you who are parents. That's pretty standard human behavior. The one touch of the supernatural in the Epiphany story is that the kings were warned to go home by another way in a dream. But honestly, that might have been their subconscious talking. After all, they had visited Herod's court and met him and absorbed the atmosphere. Maybe they just knew it was probably a better idea to just quietly leave town and not go back. So really, the Feast of the Epiphany is made up of a series of ordinary events that are made extraordinary by the birth and presence of Christ. And this is actually a central concept of the Epiphany, according to the sacred resource of the Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary. It is defined as a sudden insight or transformative moment that happens through one or more simple, striking, or ordinary events. And today's Old Testament and Gospel readings both have examples of this. In our first reading, from 1 Samuel, we see the prophet Samuel as a young boy who has just arrived at the temple and started serving as an apprentice priest to Eli. He hears a voice calling him in the middle of the night and understandably responds to what he thinks is his master's voice. And our gospel reading today opens with what has to be one of the world's shortest recruitment processes ever, as Philip becomes a follower of Jesus. And then after this, what does he do? He goes and finds one of his friends to tell him all about it. These are also simple, everyday events, the kinds of events you or I might do, have done, call a child, tell a friend. But in this case, they lead to extraordinary things. Another interesting thing that I noticed about today's readings is that the window for response seems to be a bit more open-ended. Unlike Zechariah's encounter with the angel of the Lord, which we heard about last month, there seems to be a bit more room for error. Samuel wakes Eli 3 times before Eli actually figures out what is going on, and that Samuel really is hearing a voice, and it is the voice of the Lord. But God doesn't strike them silent. God patiently waits for them to get it right. And he doesn't even seem to be that annoyed when Samuel finally answers his call. Well, that's not entirely true, because if you keep reading in 1 Samuel, you will see, in fact, that Eli is in trouble with God, but that's for other reasons, and they're not really relevant to this part of the story. And then, if you look at the gospel reading, Nathanael's response is borderline snarky. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? This sounds like first century trash talk to me. But Philip doesn't rise to the bait. Instead, he just stays calm. He wants his friend to see, and he says, "Come and see." And Nathanael does. And when he does accept the invitation, and he does meet Jesus, he is welcomed into the ranks of his followers. This illuminates yet another fact about Epiphanies. They are much more than just interesting insights, though they are interesting insights. Epiphanies offer invitations, calls to ponder and to respond. But to do this, we need to pay attention. We need to notice our epiphanies when they arrive. This may be what Paul is getting at in today's New Testament reading, although I have to admit I find it quite disturbing. To give it some context, he is writing a letter to the church in Corinth, which at that time was located, it was a port city, a very vigorous, very vibrant port city, with an equally vibrant, even riotous, nightlife. And Paul really is exhorting these specific converts to not get so bound up in having a good time that they neglect their call to follow Christ. But this reading is jarring, especially since every time I take the fastest and most convenient route from my home, for instance, this morning, I see at least one, but more often many, young women walking along the street, wearing what looked to be very uncomfortable, not weather-appropriate clothes. This morning I saw two. Many, if not all of them, have been abused, trafficked, or otherwise coerced into the sex trade. And Paul's lack of concern for this population, who are also beloved children of our living God, the God we share, brings me up short every time I encounter it. If we can get to Paul's underlying message, which I don't always find easy, it is an invitation to be aware and to pay attention, and not drown or stupefy our senses so much that we don't even notice our own personal epiphanies when they appear right in front of us. And this is also challenging for another reason, not only because the occasional Netflix binge is fun, or that we like our game nights, although they are perfectly nice ways of spending some time, but also, epiphanies do not always bring welcome news. Sometimes the changes they invite us into are painful or difficult, or we just simply don't want to do them. To be fair, some epiphanies are occasions of great joy and excitement, calling us into new experiences and a new life without regret. For example, in today's readings, if either Samuel or Philip missed their old lives or had any regrets, we don't hear about it. But then again, there are those other types of epiphanies which are more difficult, and it's so tempting to just ignore them and hope they will go away. It can be easier to just begin another round of Spider Solitaire on our computer than to click on that new browser tab and schedule a medical appointment and find out what's going on with that sudden weakness or that nagging pain. It's easier to scoff at a sense of yearning we may feel when one of our friends goes back to graduate school and is bubbling over with excitement and joy. And we sit and listen and mentally come up with dozens, if not hundreds, of reasons why that would never work for us. We couldn't possibly do that. Or it can be easier to send a partner on a shopping expedition or a fishing trip rather than to sit down with them and ask them, why have they become so quiet lately? Is everything okay? The real problem with epiphanies is that if we pay attention to them, we may have to take them seriously. through a chance remark, results from a medical test, or even a dream, we may discover that we, too, are being called to follow a new star. Will we let ourselves take that chance?